Hello and welcome to the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology podcast, Spotlights. As usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Simone Kotva. Simone, thanks for making time for us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, really a treat. For those who don't know you already, you're a research fellow at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo, and also an affiliated lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. And also at Oslo, you're part of a multidisciplinary research project on the Nordic Anthropocene called Ecodisturb, which is a very cool title. And generally, your work is situated between philosophy, theology, and ecological thought. You also have a very nice book out with Bloomsbury, Effort and Grace on the Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy. So really, you're at a lot of the intersections I'm most excited about, especially the kind of philosophical side of things. Sometimes people study religion and ecology and the philosophy gets backgrounded, but I always find it very enriching when philosophy comes to the fore. So, just to kind of get us going, I wonder if you could share a little bit about your personal journey toward that kind of intersection. Because there's a lot of people who study philosophy but aren't necessarily studying ecology. There's people studying ecology that aren't necessarily connecting with religion. It's a unique position to be in.
Yeah.
So what led you to that? And you can get sometimes people are like, well, early childhood experiences or whatever,
Oh,
so you don't have to share your whole life story, but very curious about that, yeah, your path.
yeah. Thank you so much for that opening question. I love that question. So I guess for me, part of it started when I was reading Pierre Hadot,
Mm.
his book Philosophy as a Way of Life. There's some really interesting remarks about what he calls a closer union with nature. So this Greek idea of physis, the generative world. And he argues there that the goal of what he thinks of as ancient philosophy, which he conceives of as something that preceded spiritual exercises in Christianity, that the goal was to be closer to the material world. But he doesn't really make a big thing of it, really, in his book. And so when Foucault picked up on Hadot's ideas and developed them into his idea of the technology of the self, technologies of the self, hermeneutics of the subject, he sort of drops that whole closeness to nature idea. And Hadot then becomes quite perplexed at the extent to which Foucault is emphasizing the self. And he starts to kind of reflect actually back on his own work. And so he has this really interesting essay, which is in the English translation of Philosophy as a Way of Life, where he sort of almost does a kind of auto-critique of his own early work, saying that, yes, there was this work on the self that you had to do the introspection, but the aim of it was to actually kind of step away from the self. And so that really got me thinking about how ecological thinking is a kind of necessary prerequisite for practicing philosophy and also the end of it. And as a theologian, because that's how I was trained in philosophy of religion and theology, it seemed as if Hadot was kind of opening to a discussion with mysticism, with techniques of ecstasy, to use the phrase that Monsieur Eliade uses to describe ecstatic religion and trance possession and these things. And I saw that conversation hadn't really happened. And so for me, philosophy and ecology sort of met in spiritual technologies and techniques of ecstasy and mysticism and spiritual practices. And these three things became inseparable to me, sort of the theology, the philosophy, and the ecology, and they all meet in this pragmatics, really, a technique of attention, technique of attentiveness, of opening up, becoming receptive to the more than human world, to use that lovely expression that David Abram coined. So that's how I sort of got to ecology from philosophy, but considering philosophy as a way of life and a practice, trying to figure out what kind of practice it really was, finding that practice was both mystical in essence, i.e. ecstatic, standing away from the self, but also for that same reason, ecological, because ecstasy is about foregoing not the self in some kind of essential way, but the preconceived notions, the stories we tell about the self, right? The stories we have about what it is to be human, what it means. And instead being open and receptive to what might be, what's possible outside of those stories. So yeah, I don't know if that's enough of the story for you, but
Oh yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I like, when you think about the more than human world, when Abram's often saying that, he's not, it's a very like animistic sensibility, but you're bringing it in to where the more than human would be nature, but also God, right? And both of those are the more than human world, the kind of transcendent and the immanent.
Yeah. I mean, I see a structural homology between the way in which mystics, if we're talking like the classic tradition in the West, so that becomes like codified in the 17th century, the structural homology between how mystics relate to God and how they are taught to relate to God through these different, quite intricate techniques, and how an environmentalist relates to the ecology, right, in kind of contemporary environmentalist spiritualities, but also, of course, in indigenous practices, where that's pejoratively labeled as kind of magic and animism. So Abram was trying to recuperate that and comparing it to phenomenology. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, one of the things I really appreciate about that too is that you're kind of coming at this from, the techniques of ecstasy, techniques of the self, and that it's not just the doom and gloom bad news about the environmental crisis, because that's such a big part of a very real situation. But I always feel like it's a lot for people to bear to say, hey, look, things are terrible. We should start practicing ecological thinking and stuff like that. And to think, well, it's also a way to build intimacy with the more than human world. So it's not just all the bad news. I think that's such a good framing.
But also, I mean, bad news doesn't necessarily have to be a deterrent. I think it's often presented as something that's supposed to dissuade us from acting. Like if we're sort of overcome with grief and mourning for the situation that we're in, we wouldn't be able to act. And the really great thing about reading environmental ethics in dialogue with spiritual practices, not just in Christianity, but in other traditions, is that mourning is kind of essential for you to actually do these techniques, right? You have to not think that you're perfect and you're on top of things and you're optimistic. That's kind of not the best sort of psychological situation to be in. And I think there's something to that because, I mean, environmental thinking is often compared to certain pathologies psychologically, right? We talk about eco-anxiety, and that assumes that these are conditions that we want to cure, which isn't really at all what we should be aiming for.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of Joanna Macy's work, especially, and really focusing on that, and that the despair we feel shouldn't be pathologized, but can actually be a source of empowerment. And
Yeah.
so I wonder how much this filters into the work you're doing with Ecodisturb, because disturb is part of the name. So I wonder if you could say a little about what that project is with the Nordic Anthropocene.
Yeah, so it's very exciting project. We are, as you say, trying to disturb ecology in Scandinavia, the Nordic region in general. There are a lot of preconceived notions about the Nordic region. It's often held up as a kind of paragon of environmental ethics, also of progressive green schemes. Um, and of renewable technology, I mean, not renewable energy and so on. And this is especially true, of course, of Norway, which is where the project is based, where we have Arne Næss, and we also have a lot of important eco-philosophers such as Anu Fetliesen, who's also at the University of Oslo and in our project. So we have a lot of really important figures, but the contrast to that is that actually, of course, Scandinavia is a huge consumer still of fossil fuels that are being extracted elsewhere, right? Not in Scandinavia. So Scandinavia is a really good example of the scalar clashes, to use an expression that Thomas Finland Eriksson, who's the anthropologist on our project, uses. There are these clashing perspectives and scales which impede change on a global planetary scale. And they come to a head in Scandinavia because of these extreme differences. So partly it's to do with the oil wealth that Norway has contrasted with this very, very green, like sort of public folk ethic, really, and like the love of the land, national romanticism, and then also questions of colonial mentalities that underlie ideas of Nordic nature, and the quite kind of severe degree to which Scandinavia has not really attended to the fact that it is it has built its idea of what nature is on colonialism,
Right.
which is often not highlighted at all in the kind of international discussion about Scandinavia. So yeah, we want to like disturb the notions that also like a kind of general Western audience has of Scandinavia, because we think it's built a lot of its own conception of environmentalism on rosy pictures, basically.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I know that makes sense in my context. You know, here in California, in the United States, that environmentalists are generally aware that the United States is just terrible in terms of emissions and our colonial history and things like that. And so you go, well, it's different in, you know, Northern European country. You know, it's like, no, that's
Yeah, no,
we
no.
all have that problem. And
Yeah,
just because some of us might have, you know, more emissions than others or a larger colonial legacy, like, no, we're all part of it. And
yeah,
so, yeah, I wonder, you know, how you deal with that. What's it look like to like decolonize ecology?
yeah,
That's
really good question. I think that part of that work is always listening and being attentive to what is not in your notion of your discourse, right? The story that you tell about your discourse, because decolonial thinking, if we define it the way that Walter Mignolo does, is border thinking from the perspective of subalternity. And that border thinking isn't going to be evident, right, to the sort of mainstream discourse. So part of it is listening to the border. And so in Scandinavia, decolonizing ecology means listening, of course, to indigenous communities, but not just indigenous communities, but communities on the margins, such as Faroe Islands, for instance. The islands in the Northwest Atlantic. I did some work on the Faroe Islands, and there are a lot of like outlying communities that take the brunt of a lot of climate change, anthropogenic climate change, and they have ways of dealing with kind of interacting in their environments that are being silenced because they're outlying, they're marginal, and so on. And so there's that, but there's also what is often spoken of in decolonial theory, which is regionalizing and provincializing the narrative that you have about your own ecology. And part of that is just bringing attention to the fact that, you know, the Nordic idea of nature is a result of national romanticism, and there's nothing given about it really. It's not something that is evident, and we have to query it. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, I like that a lot. I wonder, you know, like Timothy Morton's work on ecology without nature. When you see how much there's, you know, the national romanticism, the colonialism, and it's like, well, if that's what nature is, then wouldn't we want to get rid of nature? So where are you with that kind of discourse? Because other people are like, no, 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 we can recover a different sense of nature. And other people are like, no, let's just have ecology without nature. What do you do when you realize nature is so full of these kind of problematic assumptions and frames?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think that rather than reject a word, and I'm not sure that actually Morton in the end rejects it so much as rethinks it attentively, I would not necessarily get rid of the word nature, because you can look at it in a pre-modern sense. You know, you can trace the word to its kind of etymological speculative origins, where it's something quite different. But what I'd be interested in doing is provincializing it and regionalizing it to see it as a product of a certain, like the contemporary conception that we have it as a product of a certain time. And instead of trying to find another concept or getting rid of it, to focus on the practices that enable us to be attentive to the world around us. So, I mean, I'm quite with Morton and his general projects. I think that's what he does. I mean, his big point, which I always tell my students, is that ecology is often presented environmentalism as having ideas about nature, and that in order to be ecological, you have to have the right kind of worldview. And this is something which I also think has influenced environmental theology a lot, especially in the 70s and 80s, when it was
Hmm.
strongly associated with the idea of having a certain kind of green cosmology, right?
Right.
And that's not to say that all of that is wrong or anything. I mean, it's really important to think about how the stories we tell about the world, but that kind of obscured the fact that those narratives in themselves are not going to result in that practice, which is really essential. And that in fact, you need not have a narrative about the cosmos at all to practice in an attentive way. So he tries to shift that. So instead of obsessing about nature, like what is nature, which is what he sees as the national romantic legacy, to think instead naturally, I guess, like how could we practice in a way that would be like in tune, and then the concept of nature is not something you have to reject, but you reject it qua like cosmology narrative about nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I like and the shift to thinking about practices definitely resonates with your work with Hadot and Foucault, and like let's focus on the practices. Yeah, it seemed like an optimistic thing in the 70s and 80s. Where, like, if we can just get the worldview right,
Yeah.
all the good actions will just immediately follow from that. And it turns out not so much. I always think of, Hinduism is a good example where you have this idea that like the Ganges River is a goddess. It doesn't necessarily translate into caring about that river in sustainable and regenerative ways. And so just because you think nature's sacred or you think nature's not sacred, it's like, no, the ideas don't always translate into action. The worldview doesn't translate into the right practices necessarily. So yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, when a kind of state ideology or state religion takes hold of what we might think of as, oh, these wonderfully animistic ideas, they can be co-opted into something really different. I was thinking of, I do know James Perkinson's work, Political Spirituality in the Age of
Yeah.
Eco-Apocalypse, amazing book. But he also points that out, that you can have a sort of, he asks us to listen for the subaltern rebuff of Marian apparitions and so on. And they're so kind of autochthonous, right? They just like appear in this place and they're so rooted in the place. And then like a few decades later or centuries later, they're suddenly part of like a nationalist story, right? Which has nothing to do with this place in the sense of caring for it, being attentive to it, and in fact becomes really destructive towards it. And I think this is, what we see a lot, unfortunately, when you have like the animist ideas about rivers. I mean, we see this all over, and there are examples in Scandinavia where that can become then a kind of state propaganda as well. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Even the best ideas and practices can be so easily co-opted. So it's a constant vigilance to kind of maintain those practices. I wonder if you could say a little more about the way magic figures in. We said a little bit about animism, but I know that you also work specifically with the idea of magic. And that seems to be one of those things that's like, well, what exactly are we saying? What are the practices here? And definitely, where I'm at in California, it's very close to like New Age spirituality and that kind of stuff. So I wonder how that figures into your work.
Yeah, magic. So I convened with some colleagues at Cambridge a project called Magic and Ecology, which is where we brought together practitioners of magic, so contemporary practitioners and scholars. And what united both of these groups was the interest in magic as a technique for paying attention to matter that we don't normally think matters, I guess, right? So in terms of like what magic is and how we thought about it in the project and how I'm working at it is, and the easiest way to say is that magic is a practice of attention, but that comes from an assumption that magic is about perception and listening. And this really comes from the recent shift in scholarship towards magic, which has been to pay more attention to how it actually functions in both traditions where it's still practiced, but also in like pre-modern Europe, where magic was defined very much as the ability to influence the world through making alliances with spiritual creatures. And in order to make those alliances, you had to be really attentive to your surroundings, because these are invisible beings. I mean, they sometimes make physical manifestations, but usually it's like you have to go out into nature to see the sign that the god that you contacted yesterday was supposed to send you, right? I mean, this is attentiveness to place, essentially. It's ecological thinking. And sleeping out in a cave in ancient Greece to like have a dream oracle, again, it's attentiveness to place, right? Whether or not you think as a kind of modern audience, like, oh, well, that was just sort of, suggestion, that's not really the point. Like what they were doing was so conducive to being attentive to where you are. And we see this a lot also in Plato's dialogues. So we were interested in that kind of sense of magic as communication,
Hmm.
as something really quite sociable with a more than human environment, an environment that was conceived as being able to not just receive human attention, but also like elicit and solicit human attentiveness. So Abram's point about magic, which is also one that we took on board, and obviously he was a huge inspiration, and we interviewed him as well for the project, is that when a person moves to the environment, they give their attention, but they're also arrested by that attention. And so, yeah, magic as communication and as a tool for communicating more skillfully with that environment. And this is something which both scholars of historical magic and those studying magic in traditional societies have been emphasizing a lot recently, is that I mean, this comes from like material studies of magic and how there's so much interaction with the world and with matter. So that's kind of how we were thinking about magic, and we were also noting that it was used a lot by contemporary theorists as a critical concept, really, to understand environmental practice and ethics, which we thought was really cool. Basically, so Timothy Morton has this dialogue with witchcraft and uses magic. Isabel Stenger's translator into French of both David Abram and Starhawk writes about magic, and Jane Bennett also writes about magic. So, and they're quite significant voices, you know, all appealing to this practice, and of course David Abram. So yeah, that was our starting point.
Nice. That's yeah. When you list all those people, I was like, it never really dawned on me. I'm like, yeah, this is a really big kind of turn toward magic. Like all the greatest minds thinking of ecological issues are like, well, you got to do some witchcraft at some point.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah, I was like introducing Starhawk and her work to students because go, yeah, she's a neo-pagan witch, and just kind of look at everybody's face like, are we supposed to take this seriously? And because people have this tendency to be very dismissive toward magic and witchcraft, sorcery, and those kinds of
yeah.
things, and to be like, no, this is very serious. I like the definition as communication, especially. I wonder, do magic spells then kind of figure into like when people think of magic, they often think of casting spells. Would
Mm.
that be a good example of that kind of magic as communication?
Yeah, and Starhawk is someone who emphasized in her classic book on dreaming the dark. Is it? Well, yeah, dreaming the dark,
Right.
magic sets and politics from the 80s. Is she emphasizes that magic is language, and she also talks of it as attention. Attention is a word that comes up a lot in all of the thinkers that I just mentioned. So yeah, it's communication, it's language, it's another kind of language. And of course, spells are often, you know, pronounced in human language, so that's pretty obvious, right? But there's more to a spell than just saying the words. It's actually saying them with an intent that you are trying to communicate. That's the difference between what in magic is often talked about. Oh, is that ritual, did it work or not? Is it empty? Was there something there? Was there like juice in it? It's basically, was it communicating? In the same way that, you know, you can say words to a classroom without really meaning them, and then you don't really get a response. It's the
Yeah.
same kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess prayer would figure in there as well. Like if you
Yeah.
don't have the intention, it's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm so fascinated by spiritual exercises and that literature, that genre of literature in the Western tradition, because I think it's a really overlooked source for those technologies of attentiveness. And there, when you're praying to God, you're essentially being told that you should be listening out for the smallest sign in your environment, right? And you may hear the voice of God, but it's very unclear like what that actually means and how that's experienced. And I think mostly it's a sort of a heightening of the senses to what surrounds you until you get to the point where the smallest change alerts you, right? And which again is just ecological thinking.
Right, right. Yeah, I really appreciate that attention to spiritual exercise. Want to talk a little bit about your book because that's obviously, I mean, it's the subtitle, Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy, but especially this relationship between effort and grace. That seems to be part of the tension here. Kind of making yourself susceptible to something. So you have to try, but
Yeah.
to try to not try or not trying to try, like willing and non-willing or something, it's such a strange tension there. So I wonder if you could
Yeah.
share a little bit about the book.
Yeah, sure. So effort and grace. on the spiritual exercise of philosophy. It's the kind of first part in, I'm conceiving of it at present as like a duology or something, a duet, on thinking about philosophy of spiritual exercise. So in terms of effort and grace, I think that one way of picturing it might be to return to the idea of communication. So when we make a communication, we have to put in a bit of effort, right? But then we have to let go and we have to listen. And we can't sort of manipulate what the other person's going to say, if indeed they say anything, right? They might just be stunned to silence or think we're really boring or whatever. Or they might not just be listening. So we have to ask again. So I think that's the relationship between effort and grace, right? And in the spiritual exercise tradition, there is this categorization of the progression from meditation to contemplation. So what I was reacting to when writing the book was that Pierre Hadot, he bases his idea of spiritual exercise as very much on meditation and the idea of, which is that kind of initial thing, like you put in the effort, you meditate on something, you visualize and you focus your attention, you put in that effort. So he bases his idea of spiritual exercise very much on Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises, where meditation is emphasized and attention is emphasized. And he sort of leaves it there. Now, I think that's the reason why he doesn't realize how susceptible his view is to Foucauldian interpretation. Because, of course, if you actually read Loyola's work, the spiritual exercise was only one part. Like, he himself did what he called contemplation, and he had these very quite different experiences that you can read about in his spiritual journals, where he's just sort of waiting. He tells himself that he has to give up everything, no more efforts, no meditations. It's waiting rather than willing. But that's called contemplation, right? In the spiritual exercise tradition, when you have to, again, that communication, you let go and you wait. Like, was my effort to communicate effective? Like, you just have to wait for something to appear. And and then comes the dark night of the soul and, everything like that, because waiting can be, so because Hadot doesn't include that in his picture of spiritual exercises, you then get this trickle-down effect whereby the kind of idea of philosophy of spiritual practice is very much simply one of like focusing, putting in the effort, and then you're supposed to have some kind of, I don't know, reconstructed self is what Foucault, how he puts, and I think that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And it ends up being a very, human-centered idea of what spirituality is. And unfortunately lends itself to really kind of psychologizing, talking about the sort of pathologizing accounts of ecologies, where it lends itself to that kind of interpretation. And that's not the whole story. So having grace in there and receptivity and openness is really important. But there is a reason why having it was quite controversial when I wrote the book, because you have to then talk seriously about passivity, because that's what the sort of list, you say your thing and then you have to wait, stand up.
Right.
And we all know how important that is in the classroom and communication. And yet passivity has become a really, really tricky subject to talk about and theorize for obvious reasons, like being passive suggests that, you're glorifying victimization and playing the victim and so on, right? And so what surprised me was that some of the best defendants of mystical passivity came from very kind of early, almost feminist critiques of what they saw as a culture of masculine heroism, sort of macho culture of the turn of the century. And then I could suddenly see that, this is what's influencing this line from like Hadot to Foucault, without them really realizing what's going on. So that's kind of effort and grace, and for what the book was trying to do. And it ends with Simone Weil, who is the one that kind of thinks through this to the environmental questions on which I end the book, and that then become the starting point for the book I'm writing now, which is the second part in that work.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, that's yeah, I didn't know that was just a setup for book two.
It's just a setup.
Yeah, that's pretty good because there's a lot going on there. And that really helps me clarify some, because when I've read Hadot, I've had that feeling of like, this seems a little anthropocentric. And he has that beautiful book on nature, right? The Veil of Isis. And I was like, where's it's kind of just a history, the idea of it, but you lose all the practices, they're so much a part of some of the other books. And so I'm always like, I feel like there's a more ecological Hadot right around the corner. And so,
Exactly,
yeah,
right?
I'm really happy to hear you kind of bringing that to the fore, because it's always just seemed like I think that's here, but the way a lot of people read it, yeah, it's very kind of individualistic, very psychologized, and I'm like, that doesn't seem to be the whole story. Well, now I gotta ask, what's the book two? What are you writing now?
So it's called Ecologies of Ecstasy, Practicing Philosophy Through Mystical and Vegetal Being.
Mm,
And yeah, the starting point is that Ador mentions, as I say, like there's an ecological Ador out there, and yet in the discourse around philosophy as a way of life and practice, this idea of becoming closer to the material world is really lost. And you mostly have the Foucauldian interpretation, which I'm not saying is wrong, but is only a partial story, basically. And so my starting point there is to think about spiritual exercise and philosophy as a way of life as not just technologies of the self, but as techniques of ecstasy. So I use this concept that Monsieur Eliade introduces, and it's important that he introduces it in a controversial, and I do go into questions about him as an anthropologist, but he's trying to look beyond the Western canon at a time when that was, he's trying to look at mysticism beyond the Western canon and trying to look at spiritual exercises from a different perspective. And it's not surprising that he comes up with something that is not self-centered and anthropocentric, because of course in indigenous practices you have much more of shape-shifting when it comes to spiritual techniques, right? Yeah, you go into other than human forms, and you very much lose that sense of the self, which is a part of the Christian tradition, but you will then take on, it's easier to see because you're actually taking on the shape of an animal, for instance, right? So that's kind of the starting point. But what my case study is in the book is a rereading of the whole mystical tradition, really, in Christianity, showing that the idea of ecstasy and the techniques that were practiced and described are techniques that sometimes explicitly and most of the time implicitly require the exercitant to imitate not just animals, but plants specifically. So contemplation is a form of vegetal thinking, is my argument. And I substantiate this partly through a study of like some of the earlier senses of ecstasy and the Greek fathers and so on. But I'm especially interested in the early modern tradition where vegetal analogies are sometimes drawn in, like you're told to become receptive to God, like the sun, like the plant is to the sun and the rays of the sun, things like that. And I had made this connection when I read Marder's work for the first time, and the way he describes what he calls vegetal being and plant thinking, especially in that lovely dialogue he has with Luce Rigore, which is called Through Vegetal Being. The way he describes plant thinking is with obvious allusions to spirituality. And he also talks specifically about attentiveness and about the plant as having these qualities in its sort of experience of the world and the elements that very much line up with how mystical contemplation is described in the early modern period, where there is this emphasis on shifting from attention to attentiveness, from a kind of focused attention to one that's open and receptive. So that's what I'm exploring in the book. And I argue that there is a kind of alternative, it's sort of a Deleuzean argument, I guess, but there is an alternative genealogy of agency, I guess human agency, running through from the influence that mysticism has, especially in France, on various philosophers through the 19th and 20th centuries, where you get this idea of, that you do find in Deleuze as well, of the self as passively constructed and created. So it's a modification of vitalism. It argues that although, yes, kind of life creates itself, it doesn't create itself through some kind of like impetus, that like a will that drives it on, but rather it creates itself by being reactive, like intensely reactive, And if you look at like how photosynthesis works, I mean, it's just one thing reacting to another, being open to the possibility of the sun, of the water. That's Deleuze's idea of a kind of passive creation. So I trace that through.
Right. So yeah, it's like a passive activity, kind of in the middle
Yeah.
voice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. I always find that so difficult to think through just because, English grammar doesn't, we don't really have much of the middle voice represented. So it's either, yeah, it's either active or passive. You can't have both at the same time. So yeah, that's a helpful way to think through it. I really like that idea. Yeah, that contemplative exercise is a way of becoming plant. That's provocative. We're just trying to photosynthesize.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
what's the title for this new book again? I'm trying to.
Ecologies of ecstasy.
Oh, that's so good. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about Eliade because he's a kind of controversial figure. And I'm always curious, where is theology and religious studies with him lately? Because he was really influential for me when I was younger, but then people are like, oh, there's some problems there. But I do like especially that he uses a term anthropocosmic instead of, so he's not anthropocentric, but he's like, no, this something happens where the human and the cosmos kind of
Yeah.
fuse into an anthropocosmic unity. So how usable is his work? What are the things that we should be a little wary of?
Yeah, oh, a lot. As with perennialism in general, the problem isn't the enthusiastic discovery that there's more than just the Western canon, right? That's great, like they're opening the horizons, but they then assume, as a rule, that there is one master interpretation to all of these different forms of ecstasy, and unfortunately their master interpretation happens to look rather a lot like Christianity in the end, right? Or like some particular kind of Western notion. So you then have something that hasn't been regionalized, that is kind of applied to everywhere, and Messiah Eliot does this. However, there was a really good book recently called Lost Ecstasy by June Daniels. So this is a study trying to recover the importance of ecstasy and mysticism, and really the sort of position of Eliade in the sense of having an openness and attentiveness to traditions, I guess, and to the kind of interconnection between them. What she's really trying to say is that there are clearly techniques and practices that human beings share, right? Now, as I say, like Eliade's problem, or the problem with Eliade's point is that he became too interested in the cosmologies and the worldview. So it's a bit of the kind of Timothy Morton critiquing nature. It's the same idea. So he sort of mistook the practices for cosmologies, as it were. And so he's trying to find like the key cosmology that would unite all of them. And there isn't one. And that's a very violent thing to do to anyone's tradition. But I think Daniels is very right in saying that by kind of dismissing Eliade, we've also then thrown out the baby with the bathwater. We've thrown out these practices and techniques, and we've thrown out the ability to be attentive to that, right? So she argues that now there is a dominance in reading ecstasy to just look at isolated cases and not to see that there are these like shared technologies.
Right.
And I think that's really important. And that's very much a kind of Foucauldian approach as well, to see these as like technologies that you can, it's like a toolkit, and some of them are similar. Some of the tools have the same function, but look a bit different. And that's also how someone like Isabel Stengers is treating magic. She thinks that it is something that is a base of practice. And in that sense, you can see it as something that people can share, not that it's, what is it, identikit, right? But I think something like that is how I'm approaching Eliade, and the idea of, and that's why I like the idea that ecstasy it's not the mysticism of ecstasy, it's the technique of ecstasy. And also he puts it in the plural, they're techniques of ecstasy. Again, it's not one technique of ecstasy, it's actually many techniques of ecstasy. And he's at his best when he's just listing examples, right? And at his worst when he's trying to give those universal interpretations.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. 'Cause, yeah, it does seem like, we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater and we're like, oh no, this, that doesn't work. Like, well, the practices are good. And the attempt to unify it and be like, here's what it all means. And it happens to look very Western and very Christian. And yeah, those are great examples. Yeah, I appreciate that because he's just such a weird figure, and so sometimes you hear somebody critique him like, what can we do with this guy's work these days? So I like this especially, and that it's ecological, right? Because that's one of those things that's easy to miss when you're looking at these kind of techniques of ecstasy. We easily think of them as just our self in relation to God, and we can lose the material world a little bit.
Well, he's actually, Eliade is also, to his credit, the first I can think of in the West who actually realizes that mysticism is partly about becoming like a plant.
Hmm.
And he doesn't do so when he's studying spiritual exercises in Christianity, but when he did some early work on yoga, and that's when he sees that. So he's quite good at the non-human, and especially techniques of ecstasy. So the book on shamanism, which has this controversial concept that he basically invents something that doesn't exist, right? The case studies that he lists, I mean, the things that he picks out are very much centered on shape shifting,
Hmm.
and so those are really important. And it's interesting because they haven't necessarily been picked up to the same extent by later writers looking at similar materials.
Right. I would think the same for his work with alchemy. That seems to be another one of those things that brilliant connections with the more than human world, and yet somehow scholars kind of just dropped that. Like,
Yeah.
why aren't we talking more about alchemy? I wonder, is that in? Do you find that much out there? With, I mean, there's so much focus on magic, witchcraft, uh, animism. Is alchemy in the mix at all?
That's interesting. Yeah, the I would say probably that the recent resurgence of scholarship on early modern magic and the grimoire tradition looks more at alchemy than I guess before. And but yeah, there isn't a whole lot on alchemy as ecological thinking. No, that's true. Yeah.
Interesting. All right, well, we'll have to get on on top of that. There's a niche there.
But it's a mode of, I mean, there's ways of modeling the world, which alchemy is a way of modeling matter, is again like very attentive to it in a sense. Like it can become restrictive if everything's like pushed into it. But I think it's important to see most of these systems of magic as ways of being attentive to the world and communicating with it, like a language.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, one question I like to ask people in general, how do you see the relationship between your scholarship and activism? Because clearly there's an orientation here toward personal transformation, transforming the world, changing society. And yet, as scholars, sometimes we're supposed to not be activists and kind of, have some view from nowhere and all these kind of things. And so that, how do you negotiate that? Where's the activism in your work? To what extent, is writing itself a form of activism, right? So I just, it's a problem for everybody who's trying to do scholarly or academic work, but also trying to change the world at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, it's often said that good philosophy can activate thought and that good critical thinking can activate thought. That might be a bit of a lazy a lazy way of answering the question, right? We hope that's the case, but the writing in itself won't do that. It's in the right circumstances and so on, it can activate thought. That's part of the work, I guess. But I think more than that, to take responsibility for your teaching as an activist platform and not be afraid of that. I mean, there's often a lot of wariness around scholars who claim that what they're doing is a form of activism, and sometimes that's a founded worry. But I think that we have to see what, rather than see activism as something that we go out and do, to rather scrutinize ourselves as already active and ask ourselves whether, as teachers and as researchers, what we're doing is activism or not. And then if it's not, to change it so that it becomes activism,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's how I see it, because I don't think it should be an either or where activism is in a special place, because then it's just performance, unfortunately. But is this something which is conditioning what you are doing already? And if not, change it so that it is. And I think that one of the ways we do that in theology and in religious studies and in fields that are very close to spirituality is, of course, to be open about the fact that we're talking about something that is a real technology, techniques. These are not just abstract ideas that, again,
Yeah.
like ideas about nature, ideas about God. Like these are ways of communicating with the divine, with the environment. Teach those ways, right? Like, that's what we're supposed to be doing. Also, take your students on field trips where they get to test these
Mm.
practices. So that, I mean, that's activism, because that will change things, and also showing how to build habits. So I don't know, that's how I'm approaching it at the moment, at least.
Nice. I like that a lot. And I like that, yeah, get the students out in a context where they can actually test it. Instead of just learning about it. Like give it a try.
Yeah,
See and
yeah,
just see what shows up for you.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Those kind of, like especially for ecological stuff, at some point we got to get outside of the classroom and get back into the larger world and see what these things look like in practice.
And also not to like reify environmental thinking as something that you do in a special, in a designated space,
Yeah.
right? That's what I really like about thinkers like Morton and Stengers, is that they don't connect ecological thinking with environmentally themed discourse, but rather about attentiveness and the ability to get along. I mean, Donna Haraway writes so beautifully on this as well, just like ways of managing, so probably not the right word, but just, yeah, ways of getting along, not of like coming up with perfect solutions, because solutions oriented thinking is part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
But of just being able to like do something together,
Yeah.
right? Without killing each other, and without one coming out the winner.
Yeah.
And examples of that, and to see how your classroom discussion is an example of ecological thinking, or could be,
Yeah.
things like that. Like, yeah, that's what I'm very interested in.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think that is lifts a burden off of students who feel like, or for scholars who think, well, I have to come up with the perfect answers, and I have to be even an environmentalist is like an identity, and there's a specific thing called an environmentalist, and if you don't have that identity, then you're not doing it right. Like, no, it's just about yeah, getting along together. And not killing each other. I think that's a nice way to put it. Getting along, or yeah, I guess Haraway is like, well, and sometimes we have to kill. Killing gets involved with things. When I'm eating a salad, like that was alive and now it's
Yeah,
dead. And so
most
there's ways
certainly.
of killing well, not just
Yeah,
reducing things to killable objects,
yeah.
but to get along. Try not to kill so much. That
Yeah,
seems.
exactly. No, that's a really good modification. Not everyone killing everyone, but at the same time accepting what happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's but it's interesting that you say it, kind of, it does lessen the burden in the sense that, the big solution is the ultimate impediment here, and that's a
Yeah.
fantasy. It's like a pipe dream. But at the same time, it also puts the burden of responsibility on every single waking moment, and I think that's right. And here's again where it becomes very much like a spiritual exercise. My colleague and I, Jördis Becker-Lindenthal in Cambridge, just written an article on reading John Climacus in the Anthropocene. And one of the
Mhm.
great things that he says in the Ladder of Divine Ascent is that you need to keep mourning and repent all the time. Like, it's never over, right? And it's the idea that, like, I can think of the solution. When I have it, I can sort of like, lean back and I've done it,
Yeah.
right? But, and it's rather that every single moment is this negotiation. So another person I love reading about to think ecologically is Eduardo de Castro, who's an
Oh yeah.
anthropologist, and he writes about magical practices, specifically about Amerindian shamanism, as what he calls negotiation, which is another one of those communication-oriented ways of thinking about these practices we're talking about, which I think is great,
Yeah.
because negotiation is, he compares to diplomacy. It's like you have to always be kind of just aware, like you can't say, I've done it now, or
Yeah.
it's over. It's like ongoing, and it's a very sort of gray area, right?
Yeah.
It's not either or, and I rather like that. But it pushes the responsibility down to the ground level, where it's like always there. We're
Yeah.
always responsible, responsive.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We're cosmic diplomats. And every moment we're negotiating. Every moment we're mourning. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a really a beautiful context to situate that in. I know the DSM manual of mental illness added prolonged grief disorder So the DSM-5 has this thing, prolonged grief disorder, and you're like, oh, that just couldn't be worse. Like, no, grieving isn't a
Yeah.
pathology, and if it's lasting forever, that might mean you're doing it really well.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, geez, I really appreciate. I could just talk to you forever. I think we have very similar interests, and excited to learn more about your work as you keep going. You'll have you back on when the new book is out.
I'd
Uh,
love to be here to talk.
yeah, definitely. So, geez, Simone, thanks so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.
Thank you so much.